Good, good morning, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to VizConnect. It's all about connecting you with the art of data visualization and storytelling. And my name is Sagar Kapoor, and I'm part of customer success team at Tableau. So VizConnect started as a pilot last year in 2019 with one of the Tableau ambassador. And the only vision was how exactly we can go ahead and connect individuals with the art of data visualization and storytelling and the power of Tableau. So far we have hosted close to 40 sessions, 44 speakers, close to 6,000 attendees, 12,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel, and we have a LinkedIn group in which we have close to 900 members. And this has been possible with the help of our Tableau community. So thanks for each and everyone to come and present and sharing their inspiration with respect to Tableau. Go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel, VizConnect, some amazing content waiting for you. Join our LinkedIn group, some great content, talk to each other, learn from each other, and it's a great way to collaborate. So coming back to our speaker today, it's a pleasure to welcome Madhav Kannan. Madhav, he leads the embedded analytics in APAC at Tableau. So having spent a majority of 5 years in Tableau, deeply immersed in the Tableau developer ecosystem, Madhav is a part of embedded analytics team in APAC, and he works with customers to convert their data offerings into a product and monetize the same. Without further ado, Madhav, over to you.
All right, thank you, Sagar. I'm just going to share my screen. Just let me know that you're able to see it before you go on mute.
I
Yeah,
can see your
just let
screen.
me know that everything is okay.
All good.
Perfect, thank you. So thanks, Sagar, for having me today, and thank you everyone for joining. And I'm really happy to be presenting on this edition of VizConnect. Now, I'm going to be talking about a topic that's quite close to my heart, which is white-labeling Tableau Analytics. And that's because as an embedded analytics consultant for Tableau, which is something that I've done now for about 2.5 years or so, my primary task is to ensure that customers are successful when it comes to externalizing their data to their customers, their partners, their suppliers, whoever it might be, right? There are a lot of different use cases that we have for externalizing data and externalizing the insights that we get out of data. And it's my job to ensure that they are successful. Now, white labeling in itself is essentially the act of taking Tableau Analytics away from Tableau Public, Tableau Online, Tableau Server, and bringing it into your own custom web portal. And that's basically what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be going through some concepts and some demos as to how that's feasible, and then I'll wrap up with an overview of what a full-fledged embedded analytics experience can look like. As and when you may have questions, please feel free to enter that in the Q&A box or the chat box. I think at the end of the session, we'll probably have a few minutes to look into those, and I'll try and address as many as I can as well. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Now, white labeling as a concept is something that you can't really speak about too much without talking about the Tableau JavaScript API. This is probably the most significant component of embedding analytics into your web application, or white labeling, or any of those phrases that are pretty much used interchangeably, I would say. And the Tableau JavaScript API is really essential, because what it allows you to do is take that Tableau visualization and provide a way for it to be integrated into your web application. And not just that, it also allows you to actually have a scenario where that becomes responsive and can be controlled by the web application. Now, you may have heard of a concept in web development known as iframes, where you can just define a specific URL, which could be a Tableau dashboard, for example, and then you have that iframe as a part of your application. Tableau's JavaScript API uses iframes, but it does so in a slightly different way, just so that we're able to provide a model for the web application to be able to interact with the dashboard as well. And that's something that we're going to be going through quite a bit over the next few minutes. Now, the different kind of utilities that the JavaScript API offers. So first and foremost, of course, it is to be able to display those Tableau visualizations into your web application. That's a very important piece. There is the ability to export visualizations in the form of images or PDFs or data or even crosstabs, which is coming soon. So being able to do all of those that are similar to in functionality to that toolbar download function that you may be familiar with. The ability to filter data displayed in a visualization. Let's take an example of me wanting to build a filter box that's very different from the look and feel of Tableau's own filter option. And I want to bring that into my web page and still have that work with Tableau or interact with Tableau. The ability to select specific marks in visualizations and then take action as required. Responding to events. So for example, I may have selected 3 or 4 different marks and I want that to be conveyed to a different source system, or I want that to be written back to a database or something along those lines. Then the event listener becomes very significant. That's actually probably one of my favorite pieces of the JavaScript API as well. And we'll be going a bit more in depth a bit later as well. Dynamically loading and resizing visualization. So you typically have scenarios where you're either jumping from one dashboard to another, or you're on the same dashboard, but you're resizing your desktop or you're resizing your browser for specific reasons, and you want to ensure that your Tableau Viz looks exactly as it's meant to without having any issues around scroll bars and so on. And that's where the JavaScript API can be quite helpful. And finally, just retrieving the data points of a selected mark. So this ties in with a bit with the event listener. It sort of goes hand in hand. As and when you select a specific mark, one potential application of that could be to retrieve those data points. And then, like I said, either write it into a database or write it into a source system or something like that as well. Now, one thing to keep in mind, right? So before we go in a bit more into the concepts, is to just set some background as to what we're doing here today and why we're doing it. So if you can see over here, I have the typical Superstore dashboard. I think some of you may be familiar with it. You may have seen it either presented by someone else in the series or otherwise. And the main change that I've done is I've changed the background entirely, right? So everything is using the dark background. The map layer is also dark. And this is more of a personal preference, and it's also to highlight exactly one scenario where embedding is very useful. Now, what I want to do is I want to be able to publish this to my Tableau server, to Tableau Online, maybe even to Tableau Public for that matter. And I want this to be embedded into my own web application, or at least to begin with for today, my own web page. Right? So that's basically what we're trying to achieve today. And let's actually go ahead and see how that's possible. Now, I have already taken the liberty of publishing this particular dashboard to Tableau server. So if you take a look over here, you see I've already published this. I can go ahead and reload. But assuming that you're familiar with Tableau Online or Tableau server, this is a general UI that you might be familiar with. Now, the second part of ensuring that I do take this dashboard and bring it into my own web page or my own web application is to ensure that there's no Tableau branding, right? I don't want all of these. I don't perhaps even want this toolbar that gives me a very Tableau-like way of doing something like downloading as a PDF or web editing or something like that. I want to be able to do this entirely myself or represent it in my own custom CSS and so on. So that's the aim or the goal of what we're trying to do today. Now, let's go back into the concepts and understand what we can do with the JavaScript API. So the JavaScript API is basically allowing you to leverage on those individual Tableau dashboards and bring it into your own container and then define a bunch of code around it to be able to do exactly what we've just spoken about. Now, when I just show this on screen, I know that it might look a bit scary, especially to someone who may not have seen HTML and JavaScript before. And that's exactly why I'm going to break this down into a few parts just so that you have an idea. Now, imagine a typical web page, right? any web page that you might find familiar, even google.com for that matter. What it is it's broken up into different sections of HTML, and then it has parts of it that are powered by JavaScript to take action as and when users perform certain actions using their mouse, perhaps. Now, that's exactly what we're going to be doing here as well. And if you see over here, anything that's within the script tag is typically JavaScript, so you can see that it's demarcated with that. And anything that's over here is HTML. So I did tell you that I was going to break this down into a few different pieces. And the first part is actually just defining a container for the Viz. Now, going back to that example of the Superstore dashboard, just imagine that you are defining a box for it, right? And that box is going to be somewhere on the web page. You are completely in control of where exactly you want to put that box. But the whole idea is that you want to specify a box for it so that you are able to ensure that it's going in exactly where you want it to. So in this example, I'm defining what is called a div, which is the equivalent of a box. I'm giving it an ID, and then I'm ensuring that it has a specific width and height. This is typically not best practice to define the width and height exactly as this, but as this is an example, we'll let it slide for now. Now, when if you also see over here, when we're loading this up, it's calling a function called initViz, and this is a JavaScript function. So imagine that when you load that web page, the box is there. It's also calling a JavaScript function. And now what is the JavaScript function doing? So the first thing that we do is we call the JavaScript API, which is a reference to either Tableau Public's tableau2.min.js file that's got all the different functionalities that you can use. Or this can even be replaced with your own Tableau server or Tableau online hostname if required. And the second thing, and perhaps the more important thing, is that this defined function, which is called initViz, it's actually taking the container, it's taking the URL of your Tableau dashboard, it's giving a bunch of options as to what you want to do, and then it's defining it with this particular variable called Viz. Right, so that's exactly what's happening now. Going back to the example of the box, we've defined the box, and what we're doing over here is telling our web page that this specific URL that resides in this location that you can see over here, which is going to be a Tableau dashboard in this example, I want to go ahead and embed it into the box that I defined before, and I'm going to provide a few different options around it. Now, going into the URL itself, there are a couple of things that are significant. So the first thing is, of course, to specify the server name. This, again, would depend on whether you're using Tableau Server, Tableau Online, Tableau Public. You could use any of these for the basic act of embedding. That's totally up to you. Assuming that you're using Tableau Server or Tableau Online, you're also going to have a component around sites, which is predominantly present for multi-tenancy. So it helps us to provide a unique identifier. And then, of course, the workbook and the view name, right? So these are the different components within that URL segment that help you to understand exactly how you can have a unique visualization. No two visualizations will have this exact URL as the same. There will at least be something different. You could have multiple workbooks published onto multiple sites but have the same name, or you could have, say, 5 workbooks published to the site but perhaps have different names. There will be some combination of this that will be different in all likelihood. And the second part is to also provide the options. Now here, for example, I'm saying, well, I either want to hide the tabs that are there on top, or I want to change the position of the toolbar, or I want to hide the toolbar entirely. And as and when this visualization loads for the very first time, I want to display some kind of message just so that I'm aware that this visualization has loaded. So just doing a recap before we jump into an example of this. The first thing we do is define a box. That's done through HTML, typically known as a container. We then tell Tableau, or we then tell the web page the exact Tableau URL for the dashboard, and then we specify some extra options that are required, that are not actually required, but that you could bring in to enhance that experience. And then finally, you ensure that the web page is actually putting that particular Tableau dashboard into the container. So let's jump over into an example of this, right? And you do remember that we had this particular dashboard over here. You also remember that I had published this over here. Now, when I have a dashboard like this, how do I go about getting my unique URL? So that's something that's actually available over here in the share section. Again, this is available for online and public, but I'm using Tableau Server in this example. So you can see over here that I have this unique URL. And if I go back all the way to the front, this would be the default site. So it won't have the component of /t/site, but it does have the name of the workbook, and it does have the name of the view or the dashboard as well, along with a few URL parameters that you can choose to bring in if you want. Now, what I can also do is come over here to Tableau's very helpful JavaScript API page and come on to the sample that I want to go ahead and grab. And this is known as the basic embed sample before I scroll down. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to simply copy this because this is the code that we've actually been talking about on the slide just now. And I'm going to go ahead and paste it, right? So once again, you've defined your container over here. You've called the JavaScript API. You have taken a reference to that within the JavaScript. You're going to provide your own URL. So I'm just going to play around with this right now, and then you can add in whatever options that you want over here. So coming back over here to ensure that it's actually unique and related to the dashboard that I want, I'm going to go ahead, copy this link, come right back over here and paste it in the URL. This is my way of telling this particular web page that you see over here that I wanted to load that specific dashboard. So I can go ahead and just save this. And when I open this up on my web browser, I can just press refresh. And you can see that it's taken away all the nuts and bolts around it, right? If you sort of take a look at this, there's a blue bar over here, and there's a lot of text, and it's helpful text, but it's navigational in nature. But I've been able to take that entirely away and just load the dashboard itself. Now, this is a good start, but there are two things here that are a bit disconcerting. One is that definitely the background of this particular dashboard does not go with the web page that I've put it in. And secondly is that I can still see all of this, right? I can still see this kind of Tableau branding that's available over here in the form of this toolbar. So let me address the second point first, and then we'll jump into the background as well. Now, coming into the options, if you remember, we did have an option to hide the toolbar, and that's exactly what I'm going to enter over here. So I'm just going to say, Tableau, I want to hide the toolbar, and save this again. Come back over here, and this time when it reloads, notice how that toolbar is entirely gone. So we don't have that anymore. Now it's a completely white-labeled experience where the only thing that you're getting back from Tableau is the dashboard itself. Now, this is a good start, but there's still one issue that we haven't clarified, right, which is around the background and how we're going to be able to work around that. So I did come up with a basic web page that I wanted to actually embed this in, which suits the background of my Viz. And this is what I want to actually bring my Tableau dashboard into. Right now, how did I actually go ahead and get this kind of background or get this font and this specific colors that I wanted? That's through some CSS. We're not going to talk about it today, but the main portion that I want you to keep in mind is that when you're embedding into a web page, it's very likely that either you or your website developer is going to have a fair amount of CSS available that is already present to define exactly what the look and feel of that web page or web application should be. So if we're looking to integrate Tableau as a part of it, we can actually leverage on this CSS and ensure that everything else within the experience looks similar to the kind of Tableau dashboard that we've designed, or vice versa, right? And keeping that in mind, I have also added the CSS components to the div here and to what I've defined over here. And this is the first example where I'm going to go ahead and bring that in. So let me go ahead, open embed 1. And this allows me to just bring in visualization with that background, and it's almost appearing as though it's seamlessly fitting into the web page. Now, what I've also done over here is that when it loads, which is defined by this callback function called onFirstInteractive, you can see that immediately I've asked it to let me know by just alerting me saying, hello, VizConnect, and that's exactly what's happening over here as well. So I can just say, okay, and you can see that I have this fully interactive Viz that fits in very nicely to the rest of my background. So that's basically the first step to embedding, right? And this is a good juncture to sort of pause and recollect what we've done. Once again, we've defined the container, and the container happens to be what you see from here roughly until here. And within this container, we've brought in that unique Tableau dashboard. Now, if you remember, there's one thing that we did here, which is to remove the toolbar below. And in case you may not remember that, I'm happy to just remove this away so that when I come back, you can see what that toolbar experience looked like. Right, so it continues to be a fairly good white-labeled experience, but there is something jarring about this toolbar. So we do ideally want to take it away. But to be honest, the toolbar also gives me a lot of useful functionality, right? It allows me to download as an image or download the data, PDF, etc. So many different options that we have here. It allows me to set alerts or to go ahead and click on web edit and so on, or even for that matter, refresh and the other potential options that we have. So I do want to get rid of the toolbar, but I don't want to get rid of the functionality, right? And then that's the basic next step that I want to look into. So how can I go ahead and do that? And this brings us to the second JavaScript concept, which is around adding extra functionality to your Tableau dashboard. So going by what we did last time, if you remember, we first defined some HTML, and then we went ahead and defined the JavaScript to make use of that. We're going to do something very similar over here. So from an exporting to PDF concept, what we're doing over here is just defining a button in the HTML, which is titled export. And if you see over here, the button, every time it's clicked, it's supposed to call this JavaScript function called export to PDF. And when it does this, you can see over here, export to PDF has been defined as using the Tableau JavaScript API's own methodology of showing the export PDF dialog. So that's basically what we're trying to replicate, but we're trying to build our own button to do it rather than using the toolbar button. So once again, defining the HTML of the button and ensuring that we have an action associated with it, and then defining that action using JavaScript to ensure that we're able to generate that dialog box. We're also going to be doing some filtering over here. So we're going to play around with the region filter. Now, as an example, what we're doing over here is, again, defining this as the region, defining the filter controls in the form of the different values that we want to provide over here, and then ensuring that as and when I select any of these values, it calls a JavaScript function called change filter. And if you look at change filter over here, if you notice here, we just did viz.showExport PDF, right? And that was really easy, and this was just one line. And it worked because the PDF is at a dashboard level. Filtering within Tableau is not at the dashboard level. Filtering happens on an individual worksheet level. And that's why I can't just do viz.applyFilter. I have to necessarily go ahead and get the specific dashboard. So we go ahead, get the workbook, get the active sheet, which happens to be the dashboard that I'm filtering on, within which I have the different worksheets. And then finally, I get the name of the sheet itself that I want to apply the filter on. Just remember that filtering within Tableau is a sheet level concept. And then I'm using JavaScript logic to apply the filter. So whatever value you select here, whether that's value 1 or value 2, I'm going ahead and applying that over here and replacing it. So coming back to a demo, which I think would be a lot nicer in terms of explaining what we're doing over here, go ahead, open up my second example. called Embed 2. And you see over here, what we've done is we've got the same thing. The dashboard is embedded as part of the web page. No real issues there. But we also have these two buttons over here, right? These two buttons that were defined using the HTML logic that you saw over here, or a variation of it. And if you see over here, export, when I actually go ahead and do click on it, it very simply creates that same download PDF dialog box as what would happen if I actually went ahead, clicked download here, and then clicked on PDF. It's the same functionality, but it allows me to completely do away with this toolbar and have that as a white label concept and just define my own button, which is yet again, it's a similar kind of white border, white text, black background kind of layout, right? So fitting in with the kind of design strategy that I had in mind as well. So it does really help in terms of being able to white label that. The second piece is slightly different, so it's the region filter, right? And every time I hover over region, you actually see that I get these different options that I can click on. So let's say that I wanted to filter to my East region. So I could just go ahead, click on East, and you see that that automatically makes that change on Tableau. So for whatever reason, if I didn't want to use this particular kind of drop down or the different types of options of filters that Tableau provides, I wanted to have it as something that's, again, a bit more white labeled. I could go ahead and do that in a manner similar to what I've done over here. So I could just go ahead, click on region West as well, and it helps me to filter that out. If I do take a look at the source code here really quickly, just remember that other than the CSS component that I've brought in, the main piece over here is just defining those buttons, both for the exporting to PDF and for applying the different filters that I have, and ensuring that they are executing that kind of JavaScript functionality, whether that's to export to PDF or whether that is to apply as region filters. Now that takes me to the last concept that I wanted to cover today, and that is around, oh, I did forget to talk about this. Sorry, I forgot to mention that I had broken this down. But yeah, we do end up defining the HTML controls and then using that Viz object to define those actions. So something similar over here in terms of doing this at a Viz level, whereas applying this not at a Viz level, but getting the sheet that we want to apply the filter to, and then applying the filter at that level. Now, going into the last concept for the JavaScript portion, and that is basically the event listener. Now, an event listener is basically, as the name suggests, listening for you to take some kind of action or perform some kind of an event, right? In this specific example that we're going to be talking about and displaying, that happens to be a mark selection event. And you can see that we have a whole lot of code that's related to that. Once again, I'll just break it down. And this is where in the options piece, when you do actually say, well, once the Viz has loaded, make sure that you're also calling an extra function, because this extra function, which is called listen to mark selection, is something that I'm defining over here as adding an event listener. Now, Tableau has a few different event listeners. The ones that I remember off the top of my head are either around resizing the visualization of the web page, or switching tabs from one to the other, or selecting marks, or I think saving and applying custom views and so on, and making parameter selections. So there are a few different event listeners, and essentially what it means is that anytime any of those events that I just mentioned takes place, Tableau will give you a trigger. What you want to do with that trigger is completely up to you. You can go ahead and decide what kind of workflow you want, but Tableau in itself, using the JavaScript API, will give you a trigger. So even in this trigger, what you can see over here is I'm basically just saying, as and when every time a mark is selected, I want you to trigger that by calling this function called onMarksSelection, which then I can go ahead and get the marks themselves. Now, a typical mark over here has, say, the data points that would be associated with it. So if I select, say, a specific data point, it would be, let's take an example of, say, a latitude or a longitude, right? So it would have the value of the latitude, it would have the value of the longitude, perhaps any profit or dimensions that are related to it. And we'll take a look at that very shortly. Once I've got that information, I can then go ahead and do literally whatever I want, whether that is to write into a web application, whether that is to write to a specific kind of source system, whether it's just to display it. I can choose what kind of action I want to take after that. So let's go ahead and switch gears and go into the last bit. Nothing much to show here, to be very honest, just that I'm going to be displaying the marks on the web application. So I've written a bit of HTML and JavaScript just to do that. Not really going to go into detail as to what I've done here, but otherwise, in terms of how this is set up, it's very, very similar to what I'd shown on the slide, as well as bits just building off on what we had already done in the previous examples. So if I come back to this, and I'll just open up the last example that I have over here, which is my event listeners example. So you can see over here that I have the Viz loading up. I have the pieces over here. I have my buttons and all of that. But what I have is the event listener activated such that when I select these marks, for example, I actually have a lot more information written about these marks. So going back to that map example where we're talking about latitude and longitude, over here I've selected this particular state. I do have lat long based on how Tableau generates that. If that's something that you want to see exactly what information that would be, it would be lat long, it would be profit, profit ratio most likely, and it would be state. So if I switch back to this, you can see that I have that. I do have profit as well. I think that's probably part of color. And I have my lat long values over here. So as and when I make these selections on the dashboard, and this is, again, not related to a sheet. If you remember the code that we were looking at, this is at a Viz level. So this, by definition, means that if I select this data point instead of selecting this one, and I can just make sure that everything is reverted, and then I select something over here. So completely different set of selections that I'm making, and you can see that that loads over here, right? Here I'm loading consumer segment, whether an order is profitable, and some sales and month information, which is a completely different selection to what I had done here. But it still does allow me to actually select that and represent that information without adding any more code. So it's always useful to understand which of the functions are at a sheet level, which are maybe at a workbook level, which are at a dashboard level, and which are at a general Viz level, which means what you have loaded on the screen itself. And the event listeners are definitely something that I consider a personal favorite just because they allow you to understand what that user interaction is and then take action related to that as well. So we've covered a few different things. Just gonna recap through all of them. We went ahead first and grabbed the share URL that you remember over here. Just copied that, brought in our code over here where we had defined the container. We had swapped the URL out with what we had just copied in the previous screen and ensured that we had loaded that up. And then we went into defining these different buttons or filters that you see over here, which could be at a Viz level in the form of an export to PDF, because that is something that we want to export this entire piece as a PDF. Filters are at a sheet level, so we have to actually get the specific sheet name, which you can see over here. I actually went ahead and said, well, give me the active sheet, which is the dashboard. Get me all the worksheets within the dashboard, and then get me the specific sheet name called sales map, which happens to be this particular sheet, as you can see over here. So it is very much applied at a sheet level. And we went ahead, and either you can go ahead and replace them. So I can just click on all if I don't want to replace them, and if I want to clear them back. Or as you had seen when I clicked on East and West, you can go ahead and replace them. And then finally, we went ahead and applied an event listener as well, which is, again, at a Viz level. It's not at a sheet level, but its main job is to trigger an action, a user-defined action as to what needs to be done every time an end user goes ahead and makes a selection. And that's completely something that you can decide as to how you would want to take that forward. So building on from the event listeners, there are a couple of other examples that I thought would be interesting to share over here. I'll just reload this. So one such example is popping up a Tableau visualization. Now, I know that we have Viz and tooltips, and that's a very, very useful feature. But sometimes there is a requirement to actually have an interactive Viz load up as and when a user makes a selection over here. So a simple example of this would be tables, right? So if I go ahead and select tables, what's actually happening over here is that using an event listener, I am understanding exactly which mark has been clicked. I am keeping that in mind, in this case, it happens to be tables. And I'm also using that trigger to load the second visualization, which happens to be my map. And then based on the fact that I also know which mark has been selected, I am filtering it to only show me tables. And of course, this happens to be an interactive Viz on itself as well. So really using that power of the event listener of the JavaScript API to not only give me a trigger that I should be popping up that visualization, but also reading the data point exactly as it has been selected to then help me to filter and make it a bit more contextual as well, which is a pretty nifty way of using this kind of an application as well. The second example is slightly different. So this is around integrating with a D3 chart, right? In this case, it happens to be a sunburst chart, but of course you could do this with other pieces as well. So in this example, I do have this kind of a dashboard that you see over here with my furniture, office supplies, and technology. And if you see over here, I have the sunburst chart, which has got my different subcategories, as well as the names of each and every individual product and the sales value associated with it. And of course, as the case in a sunburst chart, the proportion of the string is related to the sales values as well. Now, when I go ahead and I click on furniture, for example, you can see that it loads these 4 subcategories in their specific colors. And again, using that event listener, the same thing is happening here as well. So for example, furnishings is 91705 and it's red, and I can see all the products of furnishings. And if I want to go ahead and just click on furnishings once more, it's the same event listener that's allowing me to filter even further and actually just focus on the selection that I've made alone. So it's a pretty interesting way for you to actually integrate Tableau into Tableau with another JavaScript chart provider. Of course, now to do this, we do have extensions. This probably was built around the time that I think extensions was just coming in or hadn't. But it still serves to sort of provide a good example of where event listeners could be quite useful, especially if you're going to be embedding. But you could very well do this as an extension today. This doesn't have to be something that you're only doing using JavaScript API anymore. So that's basically what I had for the JavaScript API. And I'll just come back over here. And now I'll talk about a few other embedding concepts. Now, I know that this particular session was supposed to be about white labeling. And like I had mentioned, JavaScript API is the predominant tool that you would be using for white labeling. And I'm hoping that you're starting to get an idea of why that is based on the kind of demos and the kind of code that we've gone through so far. But in no way is it the only concept that you need to be clear about if you are going to actually build out a full-fledged web application. If that's something that you're looking to do, going back into the ability to monetize or to externalize your data and your insights for your customers, for your partners, for your clients, and so on. There are a few other concepts that are also very, very significant, and I'm not going to be demoing any of these as such, but I do want to provide an idea of what this looks like. So the first one happens to be single sign-on. Now, what you may have noticed if I very quickly switch over from here is that at no point here when I did actually open up a dashboard was I asked to sign in, right? And that's probably because I've already signed in over here, so it just allows me to go ahead and use that. But if I do happen to open this up and actually access this as is, unless my guest account is activated, which it's not, which is great, you can see that it will ask me to sign into Tableau Server. And this is definitely going away from that kind of white label experience that you would look to provide, right? If everything else is matching the background and you can have those buttons, but then someone is being asked to sign into Tableau Server, it does harm that experience a little bit. And that's exactly what we want to ensure does not happen. So single sign-on is very crucial to that. There are a few ways to do it. There's either trusted tickets, which is Tableau's own ticket-based SSO mechanism. There's also things like SAML and OpenID and a few other ways to achieve this, but not going to go into detail about that today. The REST API is another very, very important toolkit because it helps you to administer and manage your Tableau server or even your Tableau online instance at scale. When you have use cases or scenarios where you are embedding Tableau dashboards into a web portal where, for example, users sign up on that portal and then are expecting to see a Tableau dashboard, there's a lot that you need to do very, very quickly, and that includes creating that user on the Tableau server, ensuring that they exist as a user entity so that you can allow the SSO to work out, as well as perhaps row-level security and so on that we'll come to shortly. So all of this is very, very significant or important in being able to manage the Tableau server, and that's where the REST API comes in. It's definitely not something when you're dealing with scale to be able to do so manually, and the REST API is a real savior in that scenario. Row-level security is simply the concept of ensuring that each user gets to see only the data that they're supposed to, which once again, in the scenario where you're externalizing data to multiple individuals, and this is not necessary to externalizing as well. This could also happen assuming that this is internal facing. But the idea is to ensure that each person who logs in is only able to access their own data and not anyone else's. And this is predominantly done by Tableau using our own username function or full name function, which is part of the calculated fields. So this ties in with the access table that you might have defined in your database. But there are a few other ways to do this, whether that is through initial SQL, whether that's perhaps passing any kind of filter values from your web application and so on. So there are a few different ways to achieve it, but definitely a significant concept to ensure that everyone is only looking at the kind of data that they're supposed to. And finally, the last piece is on the document API. So this is slightly newer in comparison, but the idea here is very much so that you have perhaps 10 customers and each of them needs to see their own data, but you also want to have individual sites defined. So you have 10 customers who are accessing 10 different sites on the Tableau server, for example. And while we have built out this template, we want to go ahead and share that 10 different times. So, and typically this would also mean that it's also connected to 10 different databases, right? One per customer. So given the number of times I said 10 in that sentence, you can imagine that, especially when you're dealing with scale, this is not something, again, that can be done manually. We do need a scenario where we've created a template that everyone buys into, but then we want to replicate this n number of times for the n number of customers that you might have. And the document API helps you to achieve that as well. So I want to sign off with one last demo of a full-fledged web application, which I think is over here. So this is more so, again, when assuming that you're looking to externalize your data, but this could also be significant in an internal embedding context. So just imagine that you have a user who comes onto the platform. Let me just sign out. I think I've already signed in. And they come over here and click on sign in, right? Now, they enter their information over here, which is managed by the web application, their username and password, and they sign in. Now, using the REST API, we can actually query the dashboards that user who has just logged in is able to access, and then provide thumbnail images similar to the kind of experience that you might remember from Tableau server. And then when I click on this, what's happening in the back end is there's the single sign-on taking place to ensure that trusted authentication helps me to sign in without me having to sign in again. And you can see based on the kind of demos that we've already done that this is a white-labeled experience where we're only bringing in the components that I'm highlighting from that top left corner to the bottom right corner here through the JavaScript API. Everything else happens to be your own web portal. You can go ahead and use the same kind of export to PDF, export to data, etc. Functionality that we've sort of walked through earlier in the session. But the idea is to ensure that the combination of REST API, single sign-on, and JavaScript API provides an experience where it's a completely white-labeled entity as far as the end user is concerned. They may not at all necessarily know that Tableau is involved in this if they've never seen Tableau before. The last bit that I had spoken about was row-level security. And here, when you see the user who's logged in, who happens to be Jamie, you can see that there's data points for Jamie across the map of the United States. If I go ahead and sign out, and then I sign back in as a different user whose name is Adrian, you can see over here that when Adrian logs in, it's the same kind of experience. They are very much loading the dashboard using the REST API in terms of the layouts. But when they go ahead and click on one of these, you can see that it's only loading one region, right? And this is back to that row-level security concept where perhaps Jamie is a country manager and Adrian is only a regional manager or something along those lines to ensure that we are keeping that data filtered to only the kind of access that Adrian should have. Even if they open up this filter box, they're not really able to make any changes as well. So that just gives you an idea of all the different concepts that I've just spoken about that would probably be needed to provide a complete embedded analytics experience from a web portal side. But a lot of it has to do with the JavaScript, which is why I also spent the majority of today's session talking about how the JavaScript API can be used. So some resources that are useful, definitely the JavaScript API along with its API reference is right up there on top, given how much time we've spoken about it for this session. Another one which has been built by Embedded Analytics, the Embedded Analytics team within Tableau, some of my colleagues, is the Embedded Playbook, and I would highly recommend this for anyone who is considering deploying Tableau or embedding Tableau in this kind of context. And all the demos that you saw today are also available on this website. So this is something, whether that's the Embedded Analytics portal, whether it's the couple of JavaScript API demos of popping up the Viz or using the DC chart and so on, that's something that you can see over here. So with that, I am going to just stop sharing. For anyone who is still listening to me, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Sagar, how are we doing on time?
We are good. We have close to 12 minutes, so we can take a couple of questions. But yeah, Madhav,
Okay.
thank you for just walking us. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Sorry. No, I was just saying I see a lot of questions. I'm just going through these. Is there, by any chance, any question that you have picked out that you wanted me to immediately address?
I think one question was there: when the Tableau dashboards are logging based, how does the API integration work for users? I think you answered it during when you went ahead and touched base on APIs. So maybe if you want to talk, we can just talk about it.
Okay. Yeah, so I think I believe that that's related to the single sign-on component. So essentially, as and when a user logs into the web application, assuming that you're going in with this whole full-fledged web application, you're going to have a scenario where that username or that email address is then taken, and then you can actually make a request for a trusted ticket to Tableau server. This is just an example of trusted authentication, which is Tableau's homegrown ticket authentication mechanism. But definitely, if you're planning to use, say, SAML, OpenID, and so on, there will be different ways to achieve it. The good part is that it's all happening in the background just prior to a user opening a Tableau dashboard, so that as far as they're concerned, they never have to see that dreaded sign into Tableau screen that you saw when I had opened it up in an incognito window.
Right, thank you. There was another question.
So Uh, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, go ahead. I was just going to pick out a couple, but if you have one, then I'll address that.
no, you go ahead, no problem.
Okay, so I'm just going to go in order and try to hit as many of them as I can. So I think the first question is, how do you get to know the name is defined as toolbar? So I think this is in reference to Hyde's toolbar, and this isn't universal as such, but it's very much a part of the JavaScript API reference. And definitely before you start building out anything to do with the JavaScript API, I would highly recommend going through both the concepts and the reference that's there. I'm also just sending this in the chat box right now so that everyone has this reference. But it's very essential for you to be able to understand exactly how that API works. I would say that there's also a concept section within the JavaScript API page, which is also pretty useful in terms of just understanding how the initialization works and so on as well. Can you touch upon how we're getting the space where we're saving the HTML code? So I'm not sure exactly what this means, but if this is related to me grabbing the sample code from the JavaScript API and then bringing it into my own web page, that's basically what I had done for each of those 3 examples that I had showed. But of course, I'd done it a bit earlier just to make sure that the CSS and so on is in line. But typically, what we recommend is that once you've got the Tableau JavaScript code in and you are able to get the dashboard URLs, then just deploy it on any kind of web server that you have in mind. In this case, I was just using IIS locally on my Windows machine, but deploy that on any web server, and then you should be able to take it forward. Can you show the CSS page once more? I think what I'll do is I'll just share the HTML and CSS files with Sagar because I don't think it will work very well on the screen share. Maybe you can take a look at it as well afterwards if you want to try it around. And can we publish this HTML page on Tableau Server? Now, Tableau Server is built on Apache, which is why we're able to actually hit the gateway. But definitely, it is not recommended to use Tableau's own Apache component as a web server. Ideally, I would very much recommend you to have a separate web server, whether that's Apache, whether that's IIS, or anything else that you might use. Please do not use Tableau Server's own Apache as a web server. Can you share the pop-up with and D2 integration code? So the individual pages actually do have links to the GitHub space where I've published the code. So assuming that you're able to access the website, which I'm again just writing on the chat box as we speak, so that you have this, you should be able to navigate over to the code and take a look at that as well. It's not using React. Unfortunately, I don't have an example using React, but it's definitely something that you can modify as well to use. And you can't use event listeners today on the Tableau server itself. Event listeners are very much only for embedded dashboards because they're a part of the JavaScript API. If a dashboard is not embedded, you can't use the JavaScript API's event listeners unless I think maybe you do a bunch of hacks, which I would definitely not recommend. But that's where extensions come in, right? So extensions allow you to deploy that within the dashboard, and extensions have their own event listeners given that they're also JavaScript based, and very much allows you to understand as and when someone has made a selection or made a click, what you want to do with that going forward, whether you want to represent that as a different chart type or other things as well. And finally, is it possible to navigate from one site to another site? Typically, this cannot just be a JavaScript piece because this will also relate to your authentication and ensuring that the end user is authenticated into the correct site. So this is always a combination of your backend, which is going to be requesting a ticket in a trusted ticket scenario or making the calls for SAML authentication. in conjunction with your front-end JavaScript that will be toggling the site name that you will be loading in. So unfortunately, it's not just a front-end exercise because for that to happen, you do need your user to be authenticated. And that typically is a call that's made from the back-end side as well. Okay, so I think I've gone through all. I hope so. Sagar, anything else that came up on the chat or anything that I'm not able to see right away?
So one question we have asked is difference between extension and JavaScript API.
This is a good question. I'm not even sure myself. So the simplest way to think about it is that the JavaScript API gets activated when you are embedding a Tableau dashboard. The extension is something that you can have within a Tableau dashboard, right? So going back to a couple of times that I've said, you don't need to embed your Tableau dashboard if you want to use an extension. If you want to use anything related to the event listener component that's part of an extension, it's very much a component within the Tableau dashboard, whereas everything we've done today is how once the dashboard is already prepared, what can you do using the web application or the web page outside of it? So that's the way to keep that in mind. Especially you may have scenarios where sometimes you require your end users to come directly onto Tableau server or Tableau online. And now actually even on public, we do have extensions enabled. So in those scenarios, you are probably better served by having that as a component within the dashboard itself. And yes, that's basically where you would have your extension coming in.
Okay, thank you.
A query around the Tableau development piece. So, I mean, typically, a Tableau developer would be the one who's perhaps taking care of the dashboard itself and taking care of the data pipeline that's coming in, ensuring that the metadata is managed and governed, perhaps, and even handling Tableau server if that is the scope of the role. Typically, it may not involve much of what we have done today, because this is handled predominantly by a web developer, either whether that's front end or back end, like I said, for the authentication back end is needed. So I would not say that what we have gone through today is necessarily within the scope of a Tableau analyst role, but it really depends on the kind of setup in your organization as well. And the workbook and code, yeah, I think I'll figure out what's the best way to share that with Sagar perhaps after the session. Sagar, especially if you have a way of doing this typically, then yeah, happy to figure out how best I can share it with everyone. But yeah, I think with that, that's pretty much it. So thank you all for joining in. Really appreciate you staying till the end of the hour. And yeah, just hopefully this was useful, and take care and stay safe. Sagar, anything from your side that you want to add on?
Nothing. But thanks a lot, Madhav, for coming on VizConnect and just talking to us about embedded analytics. I think that was important to go ahead and try to understand why it is important, useful for everyone. So thank you for that.
Perfect. Thanks everyone. Take care and stay safe.
Thank you, everyone. Take care, and we'll see you next week with another session of VizConnect. Thank you. Bye.